On a warm Saturday afternoon, the sun bathed the neighborhood in a golden light, casting long shadows from the trees lining the streets. Alex settled into a weathered rocking chair on their porch, a cherished spot where they had spent countless hours sipping iced tea and watching life unfold around them. The faint sounds of laughter and children playing drifted from nearby yards, and a sense of community wrapped around them like a comforting blanket. Alex had lived in this neighborhood for over 5 years, forging bonds with neighbors through friendly hellos and shared stories at block parties. Here, everyone looked out for one another, or so it seemed. As Alex rocked gently, they couldn't help but feel grateful for this little haven. Each creak of the chair reminded them of warm summer evenings spent under starlit skies, sharing dreams and laughter with friends. However, unbeknownst to Alex, Mrs. Thompson was peering from behind her curtains, an ever-watchful figure in her meticulously maintained yard. Today was no different. She claimed her window as her throne of judgment. Her brow furrowed as she scrutinized Alex's every move, convinced that something sinister lurked beneath the surface of their seemingly benign activity. In her mind, the very act of sitting still was interpreted as suspicious, a trigger for her overactive imagination. As she fumbled for her phone, ready to dial 911 with urgency, Alex's peaceful afternoon was about to be shattered by the consequences of someone else's misguided perceptions. Little did they know how much the events of that day would change everything, the tranquility of their porch life clashing violently with the storm brewing in Mrs. Thompson's heart. Mrs. Thompson was a fixture in the neighborhood, known for her lush garden and meticulously trimmed hedge. But behind her well-tended facade lay an insatiable curiosity and a sense of entitlement that bordered on obsession. A self-appointed guardian of the community's morals, she patrolled the streets with an eagle eye, convinced that her vigilance protected neighbors from perceived threats. It was not uncommon for her to single out those she deemed suspicious, often launching into lengthy monologues about maintaining the neighborhood's integrity. As she stood behind her lace-curtained window, narrowing her eyes at Alex on the porch, a frown carved deep lines into her face. In Mrs. Thompson's mind, a person sitting idly could only be up to no good. She had a list of questionable behaviors she kept in her head: long stares at neighbors' properties, uninvited gatherings, and any movement that appeared out of the ordinary. Alex's relaxed demeanor became fodder for her overactive imagination. What was so unsettling about a person simply enjoying their own home? With a quick tap of her fingers on the phone screen, Mrs. Thompson maneuvered through her contacts, her determination solidifying with each passing second. "I can't just stand by," she muttered to herself, gripping the phone tightly as if it were a weapon against chaos. In her mind, she was saving the neighborhood from lurking dangers she had conjured from thin air. Little did she know that her actions would not only disrupt Alex's peaceful afternoon but also stir up a wave of tension that would ripple through their well-knit community, challenging the very fabric of neighborly trust she professed to protect. Mrs. Thompson's paranoia ran deep, rooted in a past riddled with experiences that had shaped her worldview. She often recounted tales of crime she had read about in local news articles, each story reinforcing her belief that danger lurked around every corner. To her, the neighborhood was a delicate ecosystem requiring constant surveillance, where any deviation from the norm warranted immediate attention. Her perceptions of others were tinted by this lens of suspicion, leading her to draw quick conclusions about anyone whose behavior deviated from her rigid expectations. Her discriminatory tendencies manifested in a selective scrutiny of those who didn't fit her narrow definition of acceptable. New families moving into the area, particularly those who looked different or had lifestyles she didn't understand, drew her ire and concern. She would often hold court among a small group of like-minded neighbors, sharing gossip and grievances as if they were rallying cries for their self-made crusade to keep the neighborhood safe. Mrs. Thompson felt an intrinsic right to dictate how others should live their lives, believing that her opinions made her an authority figure within the community. This belief was further fueled by her long tenure in the neighborhood. She saw herself as a stalwart protector rather than an intrusive busybody. The reality was that her overzealous control only served to isolate her from others, as neighbors grew wary of engaging with someone so quick to judge. As she peered out at Alex on the porch, a blend of entitlement and fear surged through her veins. With each moment spent watching, her internal monologue echoed louder: someone must take action against this perceived threat. After all, it was her duty as the neighborhood sentinel to ensure order and safety, no matter the cost. Compelled by her growing unease, Mrs. Thompson finally picked up her phone, her heart racing with a mix of fear and self-righteousness. Clutching the device tightly, she crafted a narrative in her mind, a concocted tale of menace surrounding Alex, who was simply enjoying the afternoon sun on their porch. What if they're planning something, she thought, spiraling further into her unjust paranoia. In her eyes, Alex's relaxed demeanor morphed into an alarming facade, someone who could easily be involved in criminal activity, perhaps casing the neighborhood or worse. Determined to act, Mrs. Thompson dialed the local police department, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared to deliver her exaggerated report. "Yes, hello? I need to report a suspicious person in our neighborhood," she began, her voice dripping with urgency. As she spoke, she painted a vivid picture of danger. Alex's nonchalant presence twisted into something sinister that only she could perceive. "They look out of place, just sitting there on their porch. It feels wrong," she asserted, convinced that every word bolstered her self-appointed role as a neighborhood protector. While Mrs. Thompson spewed half-truths laced with prejudice, Alex remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just beyond their porch. To her, this was just another routine day of watching life unfold. But to Mrs. Thompson, who saw herself as the vigilant watchtower over the community, every passing moment intensified her belief that without her intervention, disaster was imminent. As she hung up the phone, an unsettling satisfaction washed over her. She had taken action against a perceived threat. Little did she realize that this decision would spiral into an unforeseen confrontation that would challenge not only Alex's right to peace but also Mrs. Thompson's grip on her misguided sense of authority within the neighborhood. The peaceful afternoon was abruptly interrupted when the sound of a police siren pierced the air, causing Alex to look up with confusion. The squad car rolled to a stop just in front of the house, its red and blue lights flickering ominously in sharp contrast to the sunny day. A knot tightened in Alex's stomach as two officers stepped out and strode toward the porch. They wore calm yet authoritative expressions, an odd juxtaposition to the unsettling nature of their visit. "Good afternoon," one of the officers greeted, pulling out a notebook. "We received a call about a suspicious individual in the area." His demeanor was professional, but behind the polite facade, Alex sensed an undercurrent of seriousness, one that made their heart race. As they stood up from the rocking chair, Alex forced a smile but felt acutely aware of how vulnerable they were. "Suspicious? I'm just sitting here," they replied, their voice trembling slightly. The absurdity of the situation began to dawn on them. How could simply enjoying their own porch have drawn such attention? The second officer took a step closer, highlighting the height difference as he towered over Alex. "We understand that, but we need to ask you a few questions just to clarify the situation." The words felt like a slow-moving wave of unease crashing over Alex. They had always prided themselves on being a good neighbor, never causing trouble. As they answered questions about their presence, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Thompson's prejudice had turned their peaceful sanctuary into a stage for conflict. While the officers remained polite, brows furrowed with concern, Alex's thoughts raced. How had something so innocuous spiraled into this moment? The sun still shone brightly, but now it felt distant and cold as apprehension settled in, a reminder that even quiet afternoons could be shattered by misunderstanding. As the officers began their questioning, Alex stood just a bit too rigidly, trying to maintain composure amidst the swirling emotions of confusion and anger. One officer, a woman with a calm demeanor, politely asked, "Can you explain what you're doing here?" Her tone was professional, but it felt like an accusation hanging in the air. "I'm just sitting on my porch," Alex replied, a hint of frustration creeping into their voice. "I've lived here for 5 years, this is my home." The words rushed out, filled with an exasperated plea for understanding. The other officer, taller and more imposing, nodded as he jotted down notes. His presence felt overwhelming, and Alex found themselves wishing they could disappear into the very wood of the porch that had been their refuge moments before. "We understand," he said evenly, "but we need to ensure everything is okay." There was no malice in his voice, rather, it was imbued with an earnest desire to do their job properly. Alex's mind raced as they glanced back at the house where Mrs. Thompson had been lurking just moments earlier. "This is ridiculous," they thought bitterly, feeling both victimized and powerless in a situation that should never have happened. "How can someone think I'm dangerous for just relaxing?" "Do you often sit out here?" the first officer continued, seemingly oblivious to Alex's mounting frustration. "Yes. This is my home. How does sitting comfortably make me suspicious?" The words tumbled out before Alex could rein them in. The officers exchanged glances but maintained their professionalism despite the visible tension in the air. "We acknowledge that you feel this way," the female officer said softly, sensing Alex's distress as she focused on calming them down rather than escalating tensions any further. In that moment of clashing emotions, Alex's indignation juxtaposed against the officer's attempts to uphold community safety, the absurdity of Mrs. Thompson's actions loomed large. The sunny afternoon felt like a cruel joke. What had begun as a peaceful day had now morphed into a confrontation laced with implications that cut deeper than anyone could have anticipated. As the officers continued their questioning, they probed deeper into Alex's background, seeking context for the situation. This inquiry gave Alex a chance to share more about themselves, a moment they seized with both relief and a hint of pride. "I'm actually a retired military veteran," they explained, their voice steadier now as they spoke about their service. "I've dedicated years to protecting my country and now I volunteer at the local community center, helping kids with homework and organizing sports events." The officers listened attentively, their expressions shifting from neutral concern to genuine interest. Alex shared stories of working with children in the neighborhood, emphasizing their commitment to fostering a positive environment for others. "I love this community," they added, gesturing toward the surrounding houses. "We all look out for each other." With each revelation, Alex's frustration began to transform into something more powerful, defiance against the unfounded assumptions made by Mrs. Thompson. They painted a picture of a person who valued peace and cooperation, someone who contributed positively rather than a perceived threat lurking on the porch. The officers exchanged glances, visibly reconsidering Mrs. Thompson's portrayal of Alex as suspicious. "It sounds like you're doing important work," one officer remarked, nodding in acknowledgement of their contributions. As Alex spoke, it became increasingly apparent that the accusations against them were not only baseless but revealed more about Mrs. Thompson's fears than anything else. The weight of her prejudice contrasted starkly with Alex's life, a life dedicated to service and community involvement. In that moment, as they concluded their explanation, Alex felt a flicker of hope amidst the tension. Perhaps this painful misunderstanding could pave the way for greater awareness within their neighborhood and opportunity to redefine what it meant to be a good neighbor in an era where divisive judgments threatened to undermine trust and connection. The officers, now more invested in the situation and sensing the underlying tension, decided to gather additional information that could provide clarity. They turned to a few nearby neighbors who had noticed the commotion. One by one, residents stepped out of their homes, curious about the police presence and eager to share their observations. "Is everything all right?" Mrs. Rivera, a fiercely loyal member of the community, asked as she approached, her brows knit with concern. The officers explained the situation, prompting her to frown in disbelief. "Alex? Suspicious? That's absurd. They're one of the kindest people I know," she insisted vehemently. "They volunteer at the community center and help organize events for our kids." Another neighbor, Mr. Chen, joined in, nodding in agreement. "I've seen Alex outside all the time, always friendly and engaged with everyone." His voice carried a mixture of incredulity and anger at the unfounded claims against someone who had contributed so much to their neighborhood. As more neighbors chimed in with endorsements of Alex's character, a palpable shift began to surround the officers. Their expressions softened further, and they jotted down notes on their notepads, visibly re-evaluating Mrs. Thompson's previous assertions. With each supporting word from those who knew and respected Alex, it became increasingly difficult for anyone to accept the notion of them being suspicious. The narrative crafted by Mrs. Thompson crumbled under the weight of real community testimony, a stark reminder of how perceptions can distort reality. Feeling a swell of pride washed over Alex as they listened to the supportive voices rising up against prejudice. It wasn't just a defense, it was a collective affirmation that challenged misguided fears and reaffirmed community bonds. The officers exchanged glances again, now fully aware that Mrs. Thompson's claims were not only misguided but fundamentally flawed in light of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Finally, one officer addressed Alex directly with newfound respect. "We appreciate your patience through this process," he said sincerely. "It seems we have some mistakes to address." The sun shone down brightly once more, casting away shadows that had threatened to engulf what should have been a peaceful afternoon. As the atmosphere thickened with tension, Mrs. Thompson was called outside by one of the officers, her expression a mix of confusion and irritation. Stepping onto her porch, she squinted against the sunlight and surveyed the scene, catching sight of a small crowd of neighbors gathered near Alex. The unexpected audience made her pulse quicken as she realized the gravity of the situation unfolding. "What's going on here?" she demanded, a sharp edge to her voice. She was wholly unaware that her earlier actions had cast a long shadow over this once peaceful neighborhood gathering. The officer gestured toward Alex, who stood surrounded by supportive neighbors, their expressions filled with sympathy. "We're investigating a report of suspicious activity," he explained. "Can you tell us why you called in about this individual?" Mrs. Thompson's brow furrowed, her mind racing to formulate a defense for her call. "I just saw them sitting there looking out of place," she stammered, trying to maintain an air of authority. "It didn't feel right." Her words, however, rang hollow against the backdrop of Alex's testimony and the chorus of support from fellow residents. "Looking out of place?" Mrs. Rivera interrupted, stepping forward with indignation. "Alex has lived here for years. They're a part of this community." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Mrs. Thompson shifted uncomfortably, feeling the weight of their combined gazes piercing through her facade. The officer continued to press her for details, but it became clear that Mrs. Thompson's rationale was disintegrating under scrutiny. Realizing that her claims were being dismantled before her eyes, anger surged within Mrs. Thompson. For a moment, she contemplated doubling down on her assertions, but the growing collective skepticism surrounding her gnawed at her confidence. The tension mounted as she struggled to maintain her composure while the tide of public opinion turned sharply against her. As Alex watched this unfold, they felt a sense of vindication wash over them. They had been wrongfully accused and yet stood supported by their community. It was an emotional juxtaposition that sparked a fierce determination to reclaim their narrative amidst the chaos that had erupted from one person's misguided fears. The confrontation promised to shift everything, both for Alex and for Mrs. Thompson, whose authority now hung precariously in the balance as her misjudgment lay bare for all to see. The air crackled with tension as the officer turned to Mrs. Thompson, his voice calm yet firm. "You made a call claiming that Alex was acting suspiciously. Can you explain what specific behavior led you to believe that?" Mrs. Thompson, feeling the weight of scrutiny from both the officers and her neighbors, hesitated for a moment, her confidence faltering. I just saw them sitting there," she stammered, her earlier conviction wavering. "It didn't feel right." Alex stepped forward, a sense of determination fueling their words. "I've lived in this neighborhood for over 5 years," they asserted calmly, addressing both the officer and the gathering crowd. "I'm not here to cause trouble, I'm simply enjoying my home." The clarity in Alex's voice resonated with those around them. "Do you often sit out here?" the officer prompted again, maintaining a neutral tone but visibly sensing the shift in atmosphere. "Yes. I often sit on my porch. It's where I relax after volunteering at the community center," Alex replied confidently. "I help kids with homework and organize activities that strengthen our community." The crowd murmured in agreement as familiar faces nodded approvingly, reinforcing Alex's claims. Mrs. Thompson shifted uncomfortably, her earlier confidence evaporating under the weight of truth and support. "Mrs. Thompson," one neighbor interjected firmly, "you've been watching Alex for no reason other than your own assumptions." The sentiment rippled through the crowd, emboldening others to voice their support. With each passing moment, it became increasingly clear that Mrs. Thompson's accusations were unfounded and rooted in prejudice rather than fact. The more Alex spoke about their contributions and commitment to community service, the more Mrs. Thompson's credibility diminished. Feeling cornered by facts and community support, Mrs. Thompson struggled to maintain her composure as she faced not only Alex's calm defense but also a growing tide of resistance from her neighbors who rallied behind someone they knew well. As the confrontation unfolded, it became evident that this was not just about one afternoon on a porch, it was about accountability and an opportunity for growth within a community that had been strained by fear and misunderstanding. In that pivotal moment, Alex stood resolute, a symbol of resilience against unwarranted judgment, and it seemed that change was finally within reach for everyone involved. As the crowd's support for Alex grew louder, Mrs. Thompson felt a wave of heat rise to her cheeks, the embarrassment creeping in as she realized the implications of her earlier actions. Her heart raced, and her throat tightened as she stood before her neighbors, faces she had known for years, who now looked at her with a mix of disappointment and disbelief. These were not just acquaintances, they were friends who had trusted her judgment, and yet here she was, on the defensive. Every word from Alex seemed to chip away at the facade she had built around herself as the neighborhood's protector. "I just thought," Mrs. Thompson began to stammer, but the words caught in her throat as she struggled to articulate her rationale. The reality that she had acted out of paranoia rather than genuine concern began to seep in, making the ground beneath her feel unsteady. One neighbor spoke up firmly, "You've been watching Alex without cause. This is someone who gives back to our community." Their voice resonated through the crowd, and others nodded in agreement, delivering a sharp rebuke of Mrs. Thompson's unfounded suspicions. The embarrassment deepened as Mrs. Thompson felt their eyes boring into her, calling into question her motives and past actions. How could she have misjudged someone so profoundly? Thoughts spiraled through her mind. What would they say about her from now on? Would this tarnish her reputation, which she had worked so hard to uphold? As Alex continued speaking about their contributions, Mrs. Thompson's confidence drained like sand slipping through an hourglass. She glanced down at her hands, nervously wringing them together as if trying to wash away the weight of her mistakes. The community she had once believed was under threat now stood united against her, a stark reminder of how misplaced assumptions could lead to disastrous consequences. In that moment of reckoning, Mrs. Thompson's role as a vigilant neighbor faded into the background, overshadowed by the realization that she had not only hurt Alex but also jeopardized her standing within a community that prided itself on trust and support. The chain of events set in motion by her call now seemed like an irreversible tide, washing away any semblance of control she once thought she had over those around her. As the police concluded their inquiries, Alex stood tall amidst the supportive throng of neighbors, a profound sense of vindication washing over them. The air buzzed with murmurs of approval and understanding, affirming Alex's rightful place in the community. One officer addressed the gathering, acknowledging the importance of keeping communication open while simultaneously reaffirming that confrontation based on unwarranted suspicion could lead to unnecessary divisiveness. "Let this be a reminder," he declared, "that we must always strive to understand before we judge." The words hung in the air, resonating deeply with those in attendance. Meanwhile, Mrs. Thompson shifted uneasily, her isolation palpable as murmuring spread throughout the crowd. Some neighbors whispered among themselves, casting sidelong glances at her that conveyed disappointment and disapproval. The trust she had once built was now crumbling, the supportive network she had relied upon began to see her in a new light, a light tainted by prejudice and misunderstanding. As Mrs. Thompson gathered her courage to speak, her voice trembled. "I only meant to protect our community." But her words fell flat against the rising tide of discontent from those who felt betrayed by her actions. "Protect us," one neighbor retorted harshly, "by accusing someone who helps our kids? You've done more harm than good." A wave of agreement rippled through the assembled group. Feeling cornered and vulnerable, Mrs. Thompson's facade shattered completely. She had positioned herself as a vigilant protector but now realized that this so-called protection came at a steep price, not just for Alex but for herself as well. The isolation was suffocating. As she turned away, retreating from the gathered crowd with bowed shoulders and flushed cheeks, it became clear that Mrs. Thompson would have to confront not only her misguided assumptions but also rebuild the trust she had lost among neighbors who had once considered her a friend. In stark contrast, Alex felt embraced by warmth and solidarity. The significance of community support emerged victorious that day, a reminder that vigilance should never come at the cost of understanding or compassion. With renewed resolve, Alex returned to their porch, knowing that home would remain a safe haven even amid misunderstanding, an affirmation of resilience against unwarranted judgment in a world too often quick to accuse. As Alex settled back into their porch chair, a warm breeze rustling the leaves overhead, they took a moment to reflect on the chaotic turn of events. The supportive words of their neighbors were like a balm for the bruises left by Mrs. Thompson's unfounded accusations. In that instant, surrounded by familiar faces and steady reassurances, Alex felt a wave of gratitude wash over them, gratitude for the community that had rallied in defense of justice. This incident had served as a poignant reminder of the power of unity and understanding in the face of prejudice. Alex realized that the real strength of a community lies in its ability to support one another, to uplift those who are wronged, and to challenge biases that threaten to divide. It was not merely about their own vindication, it was about standing together against unwarranted judgment and fear-based actions that could tarnish the very fabric of their neighborhood. But beyond gratitude, there was an undeniable resolve stirring within Alex, a determination to advocate for awareness and compassion. They understood now more than ever that prejudice, whether born out of fear or misunderstanding, could affect anyone at any time. It was essential to foster open conversations and promote understanding among neighbors to prevent such misunderstandings from reoccurring. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm golden hue across the street, Alex smiled at their friends gathered nearby. The laughter now resonated with a sense of solidarity and healing. They recognized that together, they could work towards creating an environment where inclusivity prevailed over suspicion. In that reflective moment, Alex vowed to continue their efforts in uplifting others, emphasizing the importance of community support and mutual respect. Their porch would always be a safe haven, not just for themselves but for everyone who might need it. With renewed purpose, Alex embraced the conviction that true justice is not merely achieved through accountability but through fostering a deeper connection with one another, ensuring that kindness became the guiding principle of their shared lives.